If you could go to a steel town from the old days and reopen the steel mill exactly as it was, same equipment, all in pristine condition, all those workers who've dispersed all over taking whatever jobs they can back at their old jobs, well, they'd have to be somewhat younger too. But let's say that we could rewind the clock. That steel mill would no longer be competitive by world standards. It simply would not produce products at a price and quality that anyone would want to buy. It was a great achievement for its time, and I don't want to denigrate the people and companies who built America. No. But what I mean to say is that China has not merely matched the level of productivity that we had in the 80s when we saw so many of our steel mills shutting down. They have exceeded that, and no wonder, because there's been 45 years of technological development since that point. And it would be crazy if we didn't see some effects in major manufacturing industries like steel. What's more, and I found this part very interesting. Now, there are of course a lot of Chinese people who are still working in sweatshop style factories. I don't want to pretend that doesn't exist. China still has hundreds of millions of people that it wants to move out of very low grade farming and into any kind of factory work, because that's a step up the economic and developmental ladder for them, and those people will have better lives, for the same reason that people want to work in sweatshops in the United States instead of taking some kind of other job at the turn of the past century. But Nonetheless, even though there are these mass labor deployments in some Chinese industries, that is no longer characteristic of a lot of the industries where we have gotten this idea that China is primarily a cheap labor jurisdiction. For example, in electronics manufacturing, the trend in China right now is towards reducing the role of labor as much as possible and automating as highly as possible. It's a very different thing from sort of imagining those Foxconn factories back in 2007 with everyone putting in screws and glues by hand. It's at this point, they're trying to take as much labor out of the production chain as possible. Partly that's because there's a lot of investment in robotics and modernization, but also it's partly just because those jobs aren't that desirable even in China anymore, and they can't keep workers. I was talking to one American telecom manufacturer who's in the process of doing some onshoring right now. Very impressive work, by the way. And he was telling me that that in China, the average tenure in the factory whose product he's bringing back on shore is something like 2 months. So it's now we're hoping that we can avoid that kind of a race to the bottom on labor and provide workers with the kind of dignified and meaningful work that manufacturing has always meant in the United States. But nonetheless, it shows the point. China is no longer simply a cheap labor jurisdiction. Some portion of the population is still working in a cheap labor world, but increasingly, China is working in a value-added world, sometimes in a cutting-edge value-added world. And in some categories, yes, they're ahead of the United States. You can buy a very good Chinese electric car for about $7,000 to $10,000. And, I don't care how cheap your labor is. There are lots of countries where labor is much cheaper than China, and they're not making $7,000 electric cars. This comes from advanced manufacturing and highly developed supply chains and very, very well-run factories, which, as you mentioned, include robotics, AI, and 5G as coordinating mechanisms.